Today I'll be doing my speech on the year of 1990 and the month of November. I was born on November 12th, 1990. Still kind of the beginning of a new decade. End of the first year of the 90s. You know, it kind of still felt like the 80s to most people, though. George H.W. Bush was the president, and the Persian Gulf War was just beginning. We hadn't actually gone on into the war yet, but the events that led up to the war had begun taking place. So to start off, I'll start off with some historical events from the time. So in November, Saddam fired his army chief and threatened to destroy the Arabian Peninsula. That's Saddam Hussein, who was the leader of Iraq at the time. Iraq, including Saddam and other leaders, say they are preparing for a dangerous war, presumably against the United States and other United Nations countries who were unsupportive of him invading Kuwait, which happened in November as well. He started to bring troops into Kuwait and invade. During that time, the UN authorized use of all necessary force to get Iraq troops out of Kuwait, as they did not want a skirmish or battles to start, or a war to start even, as Iraq felt for some reason they were entitled to the land of Kuwait. The UN did not agree, obviously. The United States during that time also sent an additional 100,000 troops to the Persian Gulf to help resist Iraq's forces. By Iraq at the time, there was an earthquake in Iran in November, and it threatened the oil-producing region of Iran, which could have drastically affected both that area's economy and, the U.S.'s economy on a smaller scale. Ireland elected its first female president in November of 1990. Her name is Mary Robinson. The Cold War officially came to an end as well, between the USSR and the United States. It ended at the Paris Summit as NATO and Warsaw Pact members. They signed the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe, and it reduced everyone who was involved in the Cold War, their military power. It reduced that. And then in the UK, Margaret Thatcher resigned after 11 years. She had the longest term of any prime minister in the 20th century, and she was, of course, the prime minister of Great Britain. Some other facts for November 1990. GM, the automaker, launched their Saturn brand in November 1990 for the first time. The Berlin Wall, the demolition of it was still ongoing during this time. It had just started earlier in the year, and it would continue through 1992. A 16 megabyte RAM computer chip was shown for the first time, and this was like crazy new technology. In comparison, our smartphones nowadays have about a gig of RAM, so you can imagine how limited 16 megabytes really is. Another interesting thing that happened in November, the Hubble telescope was still kind of a new thing. It was launched earlier in the year, so everybody was kind of excited to embrace this new technology and see what space had to really offer us. So we were still getting updates on that on the news all the time, that sort of thing. The cost of gas in November of 1990 was $1.34 a gallon. Today it's only about $2.25. I think that's what I paid last. So it didn't go up too much, but there really were some spikes in the early 2000s, and even more recently where gas went up to $3 or $4, which would have been a much larger comparison. The average cost of a house in November of 1990 was only $123,000. Today's average house cost for an American is $358,000. Now, an interesting thing, though, in November of 1990, interest rates were actually way higher. So most people were paying 10% interest on a house, where nowadays most people pay anywhere between 3 and 4%. So they were paying almost triple the interest, even though the houses were cheaper, which is very interesting. In pop culture, most popular songs of the time: Mariah Carey, Love Takes Time; Vanilla Ice, Ice Ice Baby; Janet Jackson, Black Cat; Poison, something to believe in. Top movies at the time in the box office and, previously throughout the year were Home Alone, Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger, Dances with Wolves, which went on to win Best Picture, Night of the Living Dead, it's a very classic horror movie, and that's it. And on TV, we had The Simpsons, which had debuted on Fox earlier in the year. Before that, it had debuted on another show as just a skit. So it finally had its own season, started its own season run. Twin Peaks was also on the air. Beverly Hills 90210, very, very popular at the time. And The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air with Will Smith. At the time, Microsoft, not quite as huge as they are today, but they were getting there. Windows 3.0 was one of the most used operating systems at the time, right behind DOS, as everyone hadn't upgraded. In the US, for video games, Mega Man 3 was finally released. And then at the time, the most popular games included Super Mario 3, Final Fantasy for the NES, as well as a few more games. Bonk's Adventure was one of them. Mega Man 2 was still really popular since 3 had just come out, so... And then in Japan, they actually launched the Super Famicom, which eventually came over to the US the next year as the Super Nintendo. But during that time, they actually used the new 16 megabit technology, which had just been discovered. So I found that pretty interesting as well. And I think that's about it. Thank you so much.